just when you thought it was safe. Since its release in 1975, Steven Spielberg's Jaws has reshaped Hollywood filmmaking, defining the modern blockbuster era and igniting a cultural obsession with sharks. As the icon resurfaces in cinemas and continues to make waves, we're getting back in the water to get a closer look at the film that still terrifies and inspires half a century later. Welcome to Classic Movie Club. I'm your host, Chad Knirk, the digital editor of Film Review. As Film Review celebrates 80 years, we're spending our summer commemorating 50 years of Jaws. Our founder, F. Morris Speed, began his annual assessment in 1976 by saying, "Let's start this report with a real success story, the surge of the film Jaws towards the quite remarkable achievement of becoming the biggest celluloid moneymaker of all time." Morris went on to say that Jaws really deserved its place, for it's extremely well made, is very and lastingly exciting, and in fact is brilliant cinematic entertainment. As part of the summer festivities, National Geographic's Shark Fest is spotlighting the ocean's most infamous predator with more than 25 hours of content, including a look into the legacy of Jaws. Renowned filmmaker and best-selling author Laurent Bouzereau has spent decades chronicling the untold stories behind cinema's greatest moments, from the life of Faye Dunaway to the legacy of Natalie Wood and the music of John Williams. He is the author behind books on cinema such as Spielberg: The First 10 Years and the Palma Decade. His connection to Jaws goes back to 1995, when he documented the making of Jaws for its 1995 LaserDisc release, an experience that set the stage for his longtime collaboration with Steven Spielberg. Bouzereau's documentary Jaws at 50, The Definitive Inside Story, offers a true cinematic deep dive into the making of Spielberg's iconic adventure, offering freshly caught insights, archival treasures, and in-depth interviews with those who lived the chaos behind the camera. From National Geographic, Amblin Entertainment, and Nedland Media, Jaws at 50 honors the cinematic landmark but also delves into how Jaws reshaped the movie business and the public perception of sharks. As Jaws at 50 premieres, Bouzereau sits down with Film Review to discuss the challenges of retelling the story behind the legend. Let's weigh anchor and set out to see if we can catch the full story behind the legacy and enduring relevance of Jaws. In 1995, that LaserDisc with the documentary Making of Jaws was like a holy grail for fans to sink their teeth into. Has it felt like a full circle moment going back to the waters of Amity?
Yeah, you just aged me by 30 years, but that's okay.
I'm sorry.
I can't believe how fast it's gone. Well, talk about full circle. When I saw Jaws as a kid, as a teenager in France, it was the trigger, really, for me to move to America. While I think the film has inspired a lot of people to do shark research and scientists and movie people, it really inspired me to want to meet Steven Spielberg. I did move to America and I did meet Steven, and he did give me an opportunity to do this original first really look back at Jaws since the film had come out. And now to be able to do this several years later is beyond the gift.
Diving back into the history of Jaws, this is a story that you know really well, yet since that initial documentary, so much has been written about the shoot and the film. How did you approach organizing and encompassing the definitive version of the story?
Well, that's a really great question because I was, as I embarked on this project, I was even wondering if I should do it because I'm like, there's so many books, there's so many other docs that have been done, and aren't we tired of hearing that the shark wasn't working? And I decided to use that to my advantage actually, and that's why I have it in the documentary. I asked Stephen that question. Is there something left to say about Jaws? And and we go on that journey together and therefore on the journey with the audience. I think that there's several things that have happened since that original doc I did and since Jaws came out. There is, of course, the change in cinema, which is the advent of CGI and how things are done. And so I think that what the doc is saying is like, with the change in technology, is this movie still relevant today? And
Mm,
if it is, why is it relevant? So that's the thematic there. Another thematic is I had completely underestimated Steven's trauma with making this film. And I think there is a real lesson there that applies not only to filmmakers, but to anyone who is facing a challenge that could change the course of one's career and one's life, as it did with Steven. And the message is basically don't give up. And so I think that makes the story more relatable. You see, my first doc, and I think a lot of the docs that have been made are very filmmaker centric. I think this is people centric. I also shed a light on the town, on the island of Martha's Vineyard,
yeah.
where people are still living off of that movie. It's literally everywhere. It's almost like you go to Paris, you go see Mona Lisa. Well, this is their Mona Lisa, really. And so I really feel that there is that sort of small town spirit against the canvas of a movie that became a phenomenon. I'm always fascinated by stories, and I do that in my films, sort of micro and macro aspect of things. So it was really fun to go there for the first time for me, actually, and to talk to some of the locals and so on. And then another layer that I really never thought of, but it was my relationship with Peter Benchley and now with Wendy, his wife, about the shark aspect of this story. I mean, it's almost, I think, social media has changed completely the landscape of many things, including shark stories. And there's so many people who reached out to me actually finding out I was doing this film about wanting to be part of it. And oh my God, I love sharks. Sharks are my heartbeat. And so it's interesting that the film and the book have evolved into something that's very respectful of nature and the ocean. And that's an important message to send. And hence the partnership with Nat Geo, which I thought was really inspired because it really sends the message of that brand, if I may call it that, stories of great adventure and
Yeah.
nature. And this is an adventure in movie making, but it really is an adventure in it's as much as about climbing a mountain that you may never get there, and you may, by the way, fall and kill yourself on the way there. All those reasons make it a very emotional story to tell, and I have to say I felt extremely proud of the result because
Mm,
I wasn't sure going into it that I was going to be proud of it or that I was going to find a story, that sort of felt fresh and new and worthy. And of course, let's not forget the guidance that I got from Stephen himself, who's extremely involved and so generous and so enthusiastic and so fun, and wanted to open his heart about what that experience really means to him.
you captured all of the elements and strands that have been out there for Jaws fans and in that lore, and also bringing in the conservation aspect to talk about the importance of these creatures and how beautiful they are and how important they are to our ecosystem. I'm glad too that you went to Martha's Vineyard. As the island is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the film, having all of their celebrations, they're premiering this film there. What's that like for you as a filmmaker to bring this story back to where it started?
Well, I'll start with a kind of funny story. I'm from France, right? And I have an accent. And when I first came to New York, with the hope of hooking up with Mr. Spielberg and his universe, I just kept talking to people about stories of Jaws and wanting to find out anything I could about Jaws. And I could not pronounce Martha's Vineyard. I literally had to practice in front of a mirror, and I kept saying Martha vinegar or something. I mean, it didn't sound at all like Martha's Vineyard. And so I was famous amongst the friends I made that I could not pronounce the name of the location where the film was made. And that could be why I never felt compelled to go there until I could actually pronounce it. It's interesting. Again, when I moved to New York, I remember going to all the locations of my favorite films, including The French Connection and Brian De Palma's film, and just sort of being awed by the connection to real life and how much I wanted to be part of the universe of the artifice of film, really. And so going to Martha's Vineyard and celebrating this anniversary, really, and my film over there, it's hugely significant for me personally, because you find yourself at a place where a battle took place, and there is great, and I don't mean to compare filmmaking to war, but where an intellectual creative battle took place,
Mm.
and to realize that 50 years later, this creative challenge, is a better word, took place is incredible. And the fact that it really is a tribute to filmmaking and to a great artist that is Steven. Those kinds of movement and benchmarks don't happen that often. I don't think there's been something that has influenced cinema, nature, filmmakers, scientists, writers, because it did begin with the great book by Peter Benchley, as much as Jaws has. So to be at the center of where it all took place, I think is only fitting, right?
Your collaboration with Steven, the making of Jaws came out first, but it actually started with the making of 1941, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What was that experience like building that partnership and collaboration with Steven?
Well, it was surreal, right? But the thing that was really interesting is that I remember my very first meeting with him, and it was about 1941, but it was something about Jaws. I said to him, I said, it's interesting. At the end of Duel, your film about a truck, when the truck goes over the cliff and dies, there is a weird sound effect. And when the shark at the end of Jaws has
Mm.
exploded and you see the carcass falling to the bottom of the ocean, you have the exact sound effect. Or am I crazy? And remember, this is 30 years ago. And he said, no one has ever noticed that before. And he said, absolutely, you're right. It was one of my favorite sound effects at the Universal Library. They pulled it out and I put it in Dual. And then I put it in Jaws as a kind of little inside thing. And you're the only one who's ever noticed that. And I think from that moment on, there was this feeling that I understood the language of his cinema. I always approached talking about him as I don't want to say as a fan, but as someone, as an appreciator of his language. He is the Michelangelo of cinema, and there's no one else like him. The humanity that he injects into something like Jaws, um, is pure Steven. And it's why the film endures the kind of success it still has. And I wrote a book on him a couple of years ago called The First 10 Years. And
Yeah.
I noticed that if you just look from Duel to E.T., all the films have a home theme.
Mm.
Duel, the threat of never going home. Sugarland Express, this couple is trying to get home.
Mm.
Jaws, they even sing about it on the boat,
Right.
oh,
Yeah.
I want to go to bed. And you have Roy Scheider's character has this dual thing, going home New York, or is this his new home? Then Close Encounters, the man leaves home. 1941, the last image is a home sliding down a dune, actually, being
Mm,
destroyed. And then Raiders, Indiana Jones, the man with no home, right? And then
mm,
E.T. phone home. And so I said that to Steven, and I said, I know I'm probably thinking all this is a coincidence, but I think humanly it's not. And he said, Laurent, I've never been far away from home.
mm,
And what he means by that is cinema. And I think, the great artist, you recognize their touch and their style and their language. And I think Jaws definitely belongs to Steven. Sometimes you look at filmmakers that I've admired, but their films sometimes are so, you're like, why would they make a film like this? It's nothing like anything else they've done,
mm.
and you don't recognize their voice. Stephen, you always recognize his voice. And not to say that he ever does the same thing twice or whatever. It's just like one of those artists that has a resonant, an important voice as an artist, and as a humanitarian. And I think, that to me, that the lesson of Jaws is really about that sort of timeless nature of those characters, very archetypal characters that we can all recognize ourselves in one of them, and combined together, they represent, the most iconic type of movie characters and literature.
Your incredible body of work talks about so many of the greatest films ever made and the people who made them. I'm curious, thinking back on the beginning of your career, your book on Palma, and working as a freelance journalist, recording commentaries for Criterion. Did you imagine that your passion for cinema would lead you to become the expert on the behind the scenes story?
Well, I'm not an expert, but I appreciate being called that. I knew from a very young age. I don't remember the first movie I ever saw, but I'll tell you something. I remember the first time I was ever in a movie theater. I never looked at the screen. You know what I looked at? I looked at the beam of light that was coming in from behind. And I was just like, how is it possible, right? And I lived
Mm,
in a very small town, and I don't know, I was like 6, 7, 8, maybe, I don't know. And my dad arranged for me to go up to the projection booth after the movie. Again, I don't remember what the movie was, but everybody left, and I went up the staircase to see the projectionist. Now, in my child's memory, it's 5,000 steps, one of those, and it's probably like 5 steps, but it's like that sort of crazy vertigo shot,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
open the door, and it's like the Wizard of Oz, it's like this overheated, grungy place with this guy who explained to me that each time there's a little circle on top on the right hand corner of the screen, that means he has to change reels. Well,
Mm,
I thought he had given me the key to the greatest mystery ever. And
mm,
so each time I would go to the movie, they'd say, look at the little, at the little dot here. That means, they're going to change. And I found that magical, that such disorganized chaos could create such magic on the screen. It sounds like a cliche, but that's how I felt. And so my introduction to cinema was really being fascinated by the behind the scenes, And when I moved here, I was reminded by an author I knew in New York. He said, "Do you remember you sent me a letter once that you said something like, 'I want to work on Jaws. I want to work on those movies, but I can't because they've been made already.'"
uh,
And he said, "You ended your letter by saying, 'But one can dream, right?'" And you know what? I got my dream.
in your life as a storyteller, I've also heard that you have a lot of amazing stories. Like you were on the set of Moonraker, you ran into Truffaut.
Who told you all that stuff?
I just looking in my research, things that I found.
Yeah, my dad knew was a consultant for the Banque de France, And so was the guy who rented the film studios. And so my dad said, "Oh, my kid wants to be in movies. Can he come to the set of Moonraker?" When I found out that the film was being shot there, and he said, "Sure, send him over." So I mean, these are the days, where nobody cared, and there I was on the set of the inside of the space station. And it was amazing. I remember, and I got to meet, later on, I became good friends with Lois. I still talk to her, the James Bond woman in the film. Louis Gilbert, who directed the film. I wrote a book on Bond, so I got to tell that story to Ken Adam and all those great geniuses. I remember going on the set and I was the first one on set. There was no one else. It was the lights were down and I was just looking at this incredible set, right? And there was the director was in the corner just looking at it going like, "Oh my God, how am I going to film this thing?" And it was just fantastic, and of course, I love Truffaut because Truffaut meant Hitchcock, and I loved Hitchcock, and also meant Close Encounters. And he had a new movie coming out, The Last Metro. I was there on the Saturday in this movie store that I would go to every weekend. And on Wednesday, which is when films are released in France, or at least then, The Last Metro was coming out, his new film. And it's just me and the shop guy, and I'm just saying, "True for this, true for that." And he literally walks into the store. And I'm
Mm.
like, "Oh my God," you know? And
Wow.
he bought two books. And I remember, my image of him was like this young, youthful guy from Close
Mm.
Encounters with like the safari jacket. Well, he was anything but. He was very formal with a tie and a suit on a Saturday. So that kind of shocked me a bit. But I started talking to him and I said, I love Close Encounters. I love your movies, blah, blah, blah. I started gushing like an idiot. And I said, "I can't wait for your new movie." And he said to me, "I am very scared." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, my past films have not been successful. And I'm just terrified that this is going to be another flop." And I couldn't believe that he was saying this to a complete stranger, a kid. And guess what? That's the movie that literally put him back on the map. It was a gigantic success. And sadly, he passed away only a few years later.
Does it feel surreal? Does it feel like looking back on your career, a dream come true?
I don't take any of it for granted. And so I'm extremely grateful for the opportunities that Steven has given me, not only with this, but my film on John Williams, my film on Faye
Yeah.
Dunaway, on Natalie Wood, Five Came Back. My whole career, I literally owe to Steven, and I've told him that many times. And yet I don't take any of it for granted, meaning I don't feel like I'm owed anything and that I should be the guy doing the documentary on Jaws and that I should be the guy doing this. So I work really, really hard each time I propose a project to explain what my vision may be and why I'm the right person to do this. So none of it has fallen into my lap easily. And it continues to be a challenge, but there wouldn't be any drama if it wasn't challenging. So I embrace the challenge and I embrace, those movies coming out of I've had an incredible year and a half with Faye was in Cannes with her and John at the Man Chinese. And then I did this little film on Hitchcock for Studio Canal, and then my book on Brian and book on Stephen. I mean, I am just really blessed and very grateful. I still have a lot of ambition. I want to direct scripted movies. I've been developing some stuff. I've had a couple of false starts, but hoping that at some point it will happen. If those films, I feel like I've evolved, and that's the nice thing about looking back at what I did 30 years ago and what I just did now is that
Yeah.
I feel like I've evolved into something that may have felt at the time, I wanted it to be the ultimate encyclopedia on Jaws, the ultimate dictionary. Well, there's something very impersonal about that. And I think this new film is much more about the human angle. And I approached it with emotions and with great empathy for everyone involved. and really try to find a compelling story for young people who may not really care that the shark didn't work, or who may not worry about that because they would say, hey, I can fix it today. I would just do it in CGI. So what's the big deal? So there is no point of reference for them. But I think that the idea of being someone so young like he was and so successful up until that moment, and then not knowing the outcome of this gigantic creative challenge that he's thrown in is an inspiration for anyone who tries to do anything. And I think that's most people. And I think young people will hopefully find inspiration in the Jaws Steven Spielberg story and may want to apply it even if they're working on Wall Street.
Laurent Bouzereau, the filmmaker behind so many excellent behind-the-scenes documentaries, including this full circle one. Jaws at 50 had its world premiere at Martha's Vineyard, where it all began in May of 1974. If you missed our conversations earlier this summer with the staff of Martha's Vineyard Museum, now's the time to reel it in and continue to journey through the making of a cultural milestone. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member of Classic Movie Club. Your support helps us produce a new episode each month and continue the legacy of film review. Don't forget to subscribe, like, review, and share the podcast with all your film friends. My thanks again to Laurent Bouzereau, National Geographic, Amblin Entertainment, and Nedland Media. You can find more details about Jaws at 50, the definitive inside story, and Sharkfest in our show notes. We invite you back next month for another adventure, but until then, here's looking at you, kid.